Welcome, everyone. My name is Cameron Tommy, and I'm with the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities. I'm joining today from our office in Greenville, South Carolina. Thank you for your interest in the Healthy Watershed Consortium Grant Program. Today, our presenters will provide a general overview of the 2018 Request for Proposals and answer questions you may have about the process or application. The webinar is scheduled to last 1.5 hours, with ample time reserved at the end for questions. All attendees are in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. To submit your question at any time, please use the chat feature in the bottom left of your screen. Questions will be collected and asked to the presenters during a Q&A session at the end. Additionally, please note that this webinar is being recorded. A video of this session will be posted on the Endowment's website within a day or two of this session. Feel free to circulate with your colleagues and networks that were unable to join today. The video will be available on the Endowment's Healthy Watershed Consortium webpage, where you can also find a wealth of information about the program and this request for proposals. Our presenters today are Peter Stengel and Jeff Lerner, and I'll now pass it over to Peter.
Great. Thank you very much, Cameron, and good day, everybody. It's a delight to have you with us. We're looking forward to talking with you more about the 2018 Healthy Watersheds Consortium Grant Program. Before we begin, just want to give a special thanks to Cameron and also to our intern, Ellie Gay, for all their help setting up the webinar. It was great to have their assistance. I'm also thrilled today to be joined by my colleague, Jeff Lerner, who is a consultant to the Healthy Watersheds Consortium Program. Always good to know who's speaking to you via these webinars. Actually, this was a photo of Jeff and me several years ago. We've changed quite a bit now, but if you ever run into us at a meeting or on the street, please stop by and say hello and tell us a little bit more about you. Jeff, give us a quick overview of your background before we begin.
Great. Thanks, Peter, and good afternoon and good morning, everybody. I am, as Peter said, I'm a consultant to the Healthy Watersheds Consortium Grant Program. I've been involved in conservation activities for the last 20 years or so, focused on large-scale landscape conservation, a lot of it focused on wildlife conservation, but also land protection projects in different parts of the country. I've worked with organizations like the Nature Conservancy and with the Conservation Fund, Defenders of Wildlife, and with the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. Thanks.
Awesome. And you're based in the D.C. area in Maryland?
Yes, that's correct.
Awesome. And I'm Peter Stengel with the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, where I'm the Chief Operating Officer. I've been with the Endowment for about 7 years. I'm actually based in a small town in South Carolina called Aiken, and I have responsibility at the Endowment for some of our watershed programs and also forest retention programs, and have the pleasure of working on the Healthy Watersheds Consortium program as well. As Cameron mentioned, this will be recorded, so if you need to refer back to it, please do. Use the chat room for questions. Don't hesitate to email either Jeff or me. And one of the key messages we want to get across today is that we are really anxious to talk with you about your projects and strongly urge that you reach out to us and schedule a call to talk about your application before you send something in. We can provide a lot of good background and feedback and hopefully make your proposal more successful or help steer you in the right direction. As Cameron noted, also want to direct you to the website where there's a wealth of information, including the current request for proposals. There's a great section that has frequently asked questions with a lot of specific information. There's a sample application there that will need to be revised, but we'll do that shortly, as well as some other backup information. You can also sign up there for the Healthy Watersheds Consortium newsletter. That is the key mechanism we have for communicating with you about updates or changes to the program, webinars from our grantees, and things like that. So please, if you have not signed up for that newsletter, please do so. It's the best and easiest way for us to keep in touch with you. Just a quick overview of this program. We're right about in the middle, year 3 of a 6-year partnership. This program was conceived by and started by the Environmental Protection Agency Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds. They are also a primary funder along with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. I want to thank those two agencies very, very much. If it were not for their support, we, the Endowment, would not be involved. The U.S. Endowment is a non-federal entity, but without support from our federal partners, we would not have joined into this program. So thank you, EPA and NRCS. The focus of this program is on protecting watersheds that are in good condition. So it is not primarily a restoration program for highly degraded watersheds. The focus here is to try and advance landscape protection while the watersheds are in pretty good shape and protect them from deteriorating further and requiring expensive restoration. So this program is really about land protection, and you'll hear more about that as we progress through the slides. Another key goal of the program is to create a community of learning amongst all the different organizations and entities that are involved in watershed protection. And our goal there is to simply facilitate information exchange and help each other learn from our successes and our failures so that we can do better with watershed protection. As I mentioned previously, this is really all about the land and the watershed. So water quality and biological diversity are important to us, as are many other things, but this program is focused on how we can protect the land and the watershed, keep it in good condition before it deteriorates any further. So Jeff, tell us a little bit more about the primary types of protection that this program focuses on.
Yeah, so there's different ways that people conceive of the idea of watershed protection. For this particular program, we're really focused on what we see as two primary different types of protection. And if watershed protection is land protection, then what we're talking about is, number one, the first type being, and this will be familiar to land trusts and other protection agencies, we're talking about securing land through either direct land acquisition or also conserving land using tools such as conservation easements, which would still allow the land to remain in private ownership, but would ensure that there cannot be further conversion of the landscape in ways that would degrade the watershed. And then the second type of protection that we're interested in is also stewardship. This is a national program, and the needs for watershed protection vary around the country. And while there are many areas that still need that outright direct land protection, there are other areas where the greatest need may be maintaining the condition of already legally protected lands, such as national forests or state parks and forests and other protected lands. If you can show us how you can accelerate the stewardship, not the restoration, but the stewardship of such lands, you may have a winning proposal. And so the pictures here attempt to briefly illustrate the stewardship concept. The picture here shows a forest before and after treatment. So the land cover is still essentially the same. We're talking about forest in both pictures, but the treated forest, which has been has had some thinning done and some prescribed burning, is actually a treated forest and therefore healthier for the watershed. And then the next point about the program has to do with eligibility. We try to keep the program fairly wide open to different types of applicants. We encourage partnerships and leveraging of resources. Federal agencies are often important for landscape scale watershed collaborations, but they cannot be recipients of a grant through this program, and we also cannot fund individuals operating on their own. But you can see from the list here that there are quite a few different entities that we will consider funding for. We do have some restrictions on the funding, even though we may recognize that advocacy may be a piece of successful watershed protection efforts. We cannot fund that activity through this program. We are encouraging the acceleration of land protection, but we can't actually fund land protection directly, in part because of our limited resources. If we were to take the few $1 million that we had available this year and make it available for direct land conservation, we might save a few thousand acres of land, but we know that so much more land needs to be conserved in order to achieve watershed protection that we'd rather help you to create new sources of land protection funding or tap existing funds or increase your capacity to work with landowners within your watershed, activities like that, so that over time hundreds of thousands of acres are actually protected. And in terms of the actual funding that is available this year, we expect to have at least $3 million available for grant. That's a little bit more than last year, and we're still looking to grow the program. We do require a match of minimum of 25%, although in the past that has not been an issue with many of the different applicants to the program, but just please keep that in mind. And just to reemphasize, we do have limited funding associated with the program, and we're looking for those dollars to be used for a really, really big job. And so you could think of our dollars as really a fuel additive to boost performance. Please also keep in mind as you go through the RFP that the amounts associated with the different grant categories, which we'll review later on in the proposal, do vary a little bit, so please pay attention to those as you're putting together your proposal. And another logistical point here in terms of the schedule this year, proposals are due February 1st, 2018. So you still have plenty of time to contact us and ask questions before that deadline. And we really do encourage you again to do so. We're really interested in hearing some of your ideas as you're putting together your proposals. We also try to turn the proposals around in a relatively short period of time and provide a response in just a few months. And the other point about the program is that, as Peter mentioned earlier, we are trying to also create a community of learning associated with the program, and so we're definitely interested in sharing ideas among grantees and others. And if you were to receive funding through the program, we would expect some attendance. Some of the folks associated with your project would be asked to attend at least a biannual grantee meeting that we would be assembling. Peter, you want to talk a little bit more about a little more detail about what we're looking for in terms of the proposals?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeff. So here's our challenge. We have generous but limited funding and ambitious plans. So you're probably all in the same boat. So the question is, or the challenge for us is, how do we take these limited resources and obtain maximum land protection results? And we're going to do that through you, of course, because you're the ones that are doing the on-the-ground projects. And with this limitation that we can't use our funding for the actual acquisition of land or for actual stewardship projects, what we're suggesting is that you use our grant program to allow you to enhance your capacity, your human capacity, or your research capacity, and do things like tap into larger land protection capital that may be available nationally or at a state level or at a local level for you, or create new long-term funding programs, perhaps develop some policies or ordinances that will result in land protection, or even undertake some analysis that will accelerate land protection efforts. So how can a modest grant from us allow you to do great things to secure larger sources of funding that you can then use for on-the-ground project implementation? So it's like the title says, how can we put 1 and 1 together and get 3 as a result for our land protection efforts? We're looking for local solutions. This is not a top-down program. Jeff and I and EPA and NRCS don't have all the answers. We believe that you at the local level have the best approaches, and so we want to tap into your expertise and your creative thinking. We love innovative solutions, but innovative isn't the only approach. There are a lot of mechanisms out there for generating funding that are tried and true, and if you can bring them to your area to accelerate watershed protection, that's terrific. We're looking for large-scale results, if we can get them, with regard to acres protected or goals achieved in your watershed protection programs. Or if you're a smaller organization and have more modest potential outcomes, can the activities that you're doing be scaled up or adopted by others who can then adopt them and do great things for watershed protection? We're looking for measurable benefits. One of the key metrics for us is acres protected. And we're also going to ask you in the application to break those down both in terms of short-term and long-term benefits. What are the results you're likely to see during the course of the contract, and what do you think might occur over time long after our funding has been exhausted? So the key question that we're asking you is, how do you most effectively protect the land and the watershed, and how can we help you do that? I think it's worth looking at some types of projects that are not likely to be competitive in this particular grant program. Remember that our focus is on land protection and land stewardship. So some of the activities that you see identified here, like replacing culverts or point sources of pollution, restoration activities, education for kids, these are all great activities, many of them tied to water quality and biological diversity. But if we can't link them back to protecting land in the watershed, they're not likely to be competitive. So if you want to undertake an education program for kids to help them understand the benefits of clean water and a healthy watershed, that's terrific, but it's not likely to be competitive in this program unless you're able to link it to an actual land protection effort. So that's the key. How do you link your activities back to actual land protection? Jeff?
Thanks, Peter. That said, I think we are very much interested in seeing potential connections between different programs. And so as Peter mentioned earlier, we don't have all of the answers among the agencies and the experts that we can tap into. But we've learned over the last couple of years, thanks in part to some of the different proposals we've received from folks like you, pointing us in the direction of some potential programs that might be complementary with our program. None of these programs are identical to our program in having a national focus on watersheds all across the U.S., and each of them have their own specific requirements. They may provide funding to support different aspects of your work. Some might even be a source of match to some of our programs' work, since some of our funds are non-federal, and so as long as we can avoid the federal-to-federal match issue, we might be able to find some complementary activities. And in general, we encourage collaboration with other programs that might also achieve watershed protection, and we welcome such collaboration within your proposals. So if you think that there might be a connection with Wild and Scenic Rivers, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this coming year, or the Community Forest Program, USDA, and we have actually funded some work that has used community forests as a mechanism for watershed protection, or you think there might be a way to connect some of the work at the around some of the Department of Defense installations associated with Sentinel landscapes to buffer those installations. These all might be opportunities for you to explore that might also help you to achieve some of your watershed protection goals. In terms of the different grant categories for this program, we have 3 different grant categories, and we will ask you to identify which grant category you think your proposal fits into. To begin with, we wanted to recognize that there are some great planning efforts that have been done, and projects are now ready for some specific implementation, or maybe getting to the finish line to finish the job. And so we created the Watershed Action Project category. These tend to be a little bit more focused activities, more strategic, a little shorter term activities. We also wanted to recognize that watershed protection is a long-term commitment. It may take many decades to achieve your goals, and we wanted to consider some projects where we could get engaged to help build successful and enduring programs. Even after a strong start and years of success, such a long-term effort could possibly go to the next level and even go faster with some additional resources. So we created the Building Watershed Protection Capacity grant category. And then the third category, finally, we have a category for new ways of moving the practice of watershed protection forward. These activities might be small or fairly surgical ways to identify a new funding source or communication tool or possibly a new land protection practice, but they could also be a much larger, bigger change in policy that might be able to actually advance watershed protection across a much larger area and also be a tool that others could adopt as well. So here we are actually very interested in innovation and catalytic and scalable activities through our Advancing This Data Practice category. I guess one of the main points about this slide is also, you can see the arrow at the bottom indicating that some of your proposals may actually fit into multiple grant categories, and that's okay. Try to choose the best category based upon the descriptions in the RFP. If for some reason we feel that your proposal fits into a different category, we can move it into that other category, and there's no penalty to you in terms of how we would actually then go about evaluating or scoring the proposal. Peter, you want to talk a little bit more about the application process itself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jeff. So one of the things you're going to notice when you look at the application, it's a fillable PDF, which I hope you'll be able to use with your computers. We haven't had much problem in the past year or so. The first thing you're going to notice is that there's very limited space for you to provide answers, and that's intentional on our part. We really want you to focus in on the core details for the project that you're proposing to us. We don't need a lot of general background on watershed protection. We know it's important. We'll give you the chance to tell us a little bit about your watershed. We're confident that you know the local area and the local players. What we really want you to do is think through your answers and give us concise, hard-hitting, detailed, measurable activities that we can use to try and better understand your program. You'll have a full page to describe your project plan. That's to give us the overview of what you hope to accomplish. To be quite honest, a lot of last year's applicants spent a lot of that space giving us very general information about the watershed. That's not what we need. We're looking for almost a business plan approach for what you're hoping to accomplish. Give us the real hard details of what you're going to try and do. There are several pages devoted to your specific goals, hurdles, and outcomes. This is kind of a stepwise process that shows us what you're thinking about with regard to achieving your objectives, what your overall goals are, the hurdles that you've identified that prevent you from reaching those goals, and then how you plan to overcome those hurdles. There's also a section in there devoted to what we call success factors. This is the result of some really terrific research by the World Resources Institute. They've analyzed a number of successful watershed protection programs and have found some characteristics that they find to be true in most of those successful cases. And so we've asked you to provide a little more information there on your particular situation. There's no right or wrong answer here. This is just background information for us. And then there's a new section this year that asks you to provide some information on similar projects. So what we're looking for you to do is, if you're proposing a particular idea and that idea has been successfully implemented elsewhere, we want to know that you've reached out and talked to other folks who've done it to learn from them what's worked, what hasn't worked, so you've got a little more information on how you can be more successful. So for example, let's say you wanted to create a water fund. You wanted to bring together water utilities and local businesses and municipalities in your watershed to create an annual fund that could be used for watershed protection. That's a terrific idea. It's been successfully implemented and unsuccessfully tried in several places across the U.S. I think it would be terrific if you could reach out and talk to some of the folks who've tried this and learn from them to better position you to be successful with your efforts. If you're not sure who else has tried something like what you're proposing, we can do our best to try and help. I'm not sure we can do that in every case, but we'll certainly do our best to help. So that's a quick overview of the application. Evaluation-wise, we use a point scoring method. We have a review team that looks at all the proposals. Obviously, we're focused heavily on outcomes and impacts. but also looking at the details in your plan. Does your plan provide a logical pathway to get you to your outcomes? Do you show a good understanding of the success factors and what's going on in your local area? Who is the team you put together and how experienced are they? Obviously, a lot of this depends on people. And then a little bit on the budget and the hurdles and outcomes and how you've laid that information out for us. So that's how we'll be judging the proposals when we get to them. A little bit on project evaluation. Some of the key metrics that we're using when we, the endowment, report back to EPA and NRCS are number of acres protected or number of acres treated through stewardship activities, funding streams or new funding sources that are created, new policies that are created. What have you accomplished that's likely to lead to land protection activities down the road? With regard to your specific proposal, rather than giving you a lot of guidance on how to establish metrics and evaluate the project, we're going to rely on you to identify those for us. You know the area better than we do and know the players and what's needed. So we're going to ask you how you'll move the needle during the course of the grant period. And that's why there's such a focus on goals and other activities associated with that evaluation. We really put that into your court so that you can tell us what you're thinking. And we also want you to realize that we want this to be a collaborative effort. You're the experts, you've got the local knowledge, but we have a great network of watershed protection groups across the country. We have some fantastic resources available at EPA and NRCS and other agency partners, and we want to help you be successful. Our success depends on your success. If you ever watched the program Shark Tank, when those sharks invest, one of the first things they do is go out and start to work with the people with whom they've invested to help make them more successful. And if we can do that with you, we want to be able to do that. So Jeff and I are available. We also have help from folks like Todd Gartner at World Resources Institute and Kitty Weissman, who's a consultant working primarily in the Southeast. We're available to help and try and make you more successful and do our best to move your project along in the way that you'd like to see it go. Jeff?
Thanks, Peter. And speaking of success, we have been really thrilled with the response that we've gotten to this program. We've said this is the third year of the grant program. In the first couple of years, we've received a lot of interest. It's been fairly competitive. There have been a lot of good proposals. It's been very difficult for us to make decisions about which proposals to fund, given the limited resources and the large amount of interest. Over 243 applications have been received, requesting about $54 million in funding. We've received proposals from just about every state, a couple of different territories, and we've had a fair amount of diversity in the applicant pool. We've had large and small groups, some public and private organizations, regional governments, state agencies, etc. So we encourage applications from a variety of different sources, and we're here to try to answer your questions as best we can. In terms of what we have funded, we've funded now $4.2 million through the program in 25 awards. Most of these have gone to nonprofits, but again, there's been a little variety there. There's been some large nonprofits, smaller nonprofits, regionally focused nonprofits, national nonprofits. We did also fund a state agency, direct funding to a tribe, but some of the other projects you'll hear about include collaboration with at least another tribe. We funded a publicly owned water utility, a local government consortium, and a consulting firm. We believe the results that we expect are going to be pretty impressive, over 500,000 acres and over 500 stream miles protected just in the next few years. And we do ask you to identify both short and long-term goals associated with your project to see if you can articulate a long-term vision for your watershed And if you can put acreage figures associated with that, it helps us to understand where you're headed over the next 10 to 20 years. And that's how we arrive at this much larger, ambitious protection goal of over 7.5 million acres associated with the different watershed areas that we've invested in so far. And just to give you further a bit more examples now of what we have funded, Peter and I are going to talk a little bit about some different projects that we did fund. These are projects that we feel really did hit the mark in terms of the program that we've put together, and we're happy to share just a few of those examples with you today. Peter?
Great, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so we'll just highlight a couple of the projects that we think epitomize the approach that's best suited to this program. So we'll wrap up with some of these examples. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the watersheds themselves or the organizations, but really instead focus on why the review committee selected these projects, just to give you an idea of what made them appropriate in our mind. So one great example we have is the Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast. They're down in Florida. They're working on a project called the Mayaca Island Conservation Corridor. $156,000 3-year award. Their goal was about 7,000 acres in easements. So here's what we really liked about this project. Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast is a relatively small land trust. They've been around for a while. They've had good success. They came to us and said, look, we've got several large ranchers down here that own critical land in the watershed, and they're very interested in doing conservation easements to protect the integrity of their land. We also know that there are some viable funding sources out there that would be just right to help finance these conservation easements. Our limitation as an organization is we don't have the staff capacity to go out and negotiate with these landowners and work through the conservation easements, nor do we have the capacity to apply to these fairly complex funding programs to get the money we need to do the easements. Basically, they said, we're so caught up in keeping the lights on and the doors open, we don't have time to do these big projects. But if you help us with an award to expand our capacity a little bit and allow our leadership to focus on these big prizes, we think we can deliver these projects back to you. And so that's why we picked them. And just to give you some example of the kind of leverage they took on, our award was $156,000, but as you can see at the bottom of this slide, they've been able to tap into some pretty large sources of funding to help finance the actual conservation easement itself. So the Healthy Watersheds Consortium Award, the $156,000, provided capacity support for the organization that allowed them to go out and secure these much larger sources of funding to finance the actual easement itself. That's the kind of leverage and approach that we're looking for. Here's another example from the West Coast, the Western Rivers Conservancy. They've been working very successfully in the Blue Creek and Klamath River areas. They have a very large goal there, protecting about 47,000 acres. They wanted to create a community forest. That's a forest that's owned by the community and managed for profit, but also for protection. And they wanted to create a salmon sanctuary. They've got a partnership with the Yurok tribe and very focused on helping protect rural jobs in Northern California. It's a big money project, and they had some skill sets that we thought were really important that allowed them to go after new market tax credits, carbon offset funding on the California carbon market, and also state revolving fund loan programs. These are relatively complex funding mechanisms. They take a lot of staff time and a lot of expertise. And our award from the Healthy Watersheds Consortium program provided them with the capacity support they needed to go out and secure this additional funding to actually purchase the conservation easements and buy the land that they were after. So again, it's allowing them the capacity to go out and do bigger and better things to secure large sources of funding. Another example from California is with Pacific Forest Trust. They have some big, hairy, audacious goals if you've ever seen them. They're looking to bring about change on a statewide level. They're looking at some of the most important watersheds in California, a total of about 7 million acres to be protected and restored and provide clean water to a large segment of California's population. They estimate to protect and restore that land, they're going to need in excess of $4 billion. And so they're looking at a number of different mechanisms kind of revolving around what we call beneficiary pays systems, whereby water users pay a small amount to protect their watershed. SRFs are the state revolving fund loan programs, which are set up primarily for gray infrastructure associated with water treatment plants, but can also be used for land protection and restoration. And then Pacific Forest Trust has also been very successful bringing about some changes in state policies. The biggest victory they've had put watershed management funding basically on a par with hard infrastructure like dams and pipes for state and federal funding. So that opens up a big door, a big opportunity for new funding to come in for watershed protection. Traditionally, reservoirs and pipes and dams have been viewed very differently from watershed protection. This puts them on par. It's all part of the same system, and we think will open some doors for big funding for watershed protection and restoration in California. Jeff?
Thanks, Peter. The next example comes from the New England area. This is actually a grant that was made to the Down East Salmon Federation. This is like the Myakka River example, this is a relatively smaller size organization, but they do have a small land trust associated with them. They've developed extremely good relationships with folks within their watershed, and the area that they're in is a relatively intact area with lots of opportunity for protection. This has really intact river systems with maybe with the exception maybe just a couple of different fish species missing from the system. And so there's a tremendous opportunity to do protection along the different streams and rivers of their region. And so what we wanted to do was figure out how we can help them go faster so that they could protect literally hundreds of miles of streams. And so by providing a little bit of additional support to them so that they could hire an additional person to be able to engage in some of those conversations with individual landowners, do some additional fundraising, we're increasing their capacity so that they can protect about 10 miles of stream every year. And we're talking about both sides of the river in this case. So the reason why we thought this was really a great project for us to invest in, it's an ecologically intact area. There's a lot of available inexpensive land. And this is an organization that has a great track record and was poised really to be able to go faster with just a little bit of additional investment. Next example I have to share, moving over to the West Coast, is with a grant we made to the Puget Sound Regional Council in the Seattle metro area. We made this grant as an interesting test of regional governance to determine if that could be a tool that we could use for watershed protection. It seems like it should be a good fit, but it's not without its challenges, as the council has to coordinate across many different individual jurisdictions and is attempting to identify some priority watershed protection targets as it's putting together a regional plan for growth in the area as well. So this is an example of a project in a somewhat urbanizing area, but where we believe the focus of the actual protection work will be in largely intact forested portions of the watershed which contain functional freshwater ecosystems. The next example comes from the Chagrin River Watershed Partners working in the Cleveland metro area on the Lake Erie, in the Lake Erie watershed. This is another way of approaching community engagement. It's not a regional governance structure, but this watershed partnership does work extremely well with a lot of individual communities throughout their service area. They also have good relationships with many local land trusts and been able to bring them together to work collaboratively on a combination of direct land conservation activities and also local policy measures that will help protect watershed through things like setback buffers along streams. So this is another urbanizing area, but one which also contains intact blocks of forest, as well as several rivers which the state has designated as wild and scenic rivers. So it's another test of how you engage with communities to actually get at that issue of watershed protection. And they'll also be using funding from the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund in the state of Ohio, which is available to applicants on a competitive basis to fund non-point source pollution prevention projects, including land protection and restoration activities as well. And so they'll be tapping into that fund for some of the land protection dollars that they need for their work. The next example is from the Southeast. The Foothills Conservancy is working in the Charlotte, North Carolina metro area. What really drew us to this project was the engagement with several water utilities, which all use the same watershed, and how they are poised to put together a watershed protection fund supported by these utilities to help advance watershed protection. So after many years of conversation about the health of the watershed and what's needed in terms of protection, we believe that the utilities are now at a point where they will collaboratively put dollars together for the purposes of land conservation in the watershed. Such collaboration among utilities is pretty rare, and we think that this could actually stimulate more replication around the U.S. And the last example I have to share actually comes from a grant we made to the Blackfeet tribe this past year. This is the project is located in part of northern Montana known as the Crown of the Continent. What drew us to this particular project was that it was a large source of funding for protection that was available, but there was a need for the capacity to guide how it was being used and accessing those dollars specifically for watershed protection. So using settlement funds that they had available, the tribe is in the process of creating a tribal buyback program, which is being now focused on creating a 10-mile wide corridor on the eastern edge of Glacier National Park. The tribe's Fish and Wildlife Department will be developing a watershed plan to guide the management of those lands once protected, which will cover the headwaters of 3 different watersheds that come together in their area, the Marias, the Milk, and the St. Mary River Basin. So again, these are just a few examples among many of the projects that we funded, and we're happy to talk a little bit more about them with you and about some of the other projects. Peter, do you want to take this one?
Yep, absolutely. Well, thanks, everybody. 2 final points just wanted to make, and then we'll turn it over to questions. Please keep in mind that this program is not focused solely on forests. Forests often make up watershed cover, and so a lot of the projects have involved forests, but it is not exclusively for forests. Some of the best projects we've done so far have been on healthy, well-managed agricultural lands. So we're open to considering any sort of land cover types in the watershed that are in good shape and that could use some protection or stewardship. Also want to remind everybody that we're also focused a lot on the sustainability of your efforts. Ideally, we'd like to be able to give you a grant that, as Jeff said, kind of supercharges your organization and allows you to not only accomplish more things during our grant period, but hopefully create some momentum that allows you to continue to do great things for years into the future. And so we're going to focus a lot on the sustainability of your efforts and how you plan to keep things going into the future. So, for example, several of the projects we just described involve funding for personnel, and we're going to want to try and hear from you how you would keep funding for those personnel going after our grant period ends. So think about sustainability as you're preparing your proposals. Again, we strongly urge that you contact either Jeff or me to discuss your project ideas. Before you submit a proposal, we can help you better understand what will be competitive, what will be competitive. Secondary contacts, Todd and Kitty, who can talk about project-specific issues. They are less familiar with the application process, so come to Jeff and me for the application process, and Todd and Kitty for general watershed protection questions. And with that, I think we'll wrap up and Cameron, do our best to answer any questions that have come in.
Great. Thank you, Peter and Jeff. We've had a handful of questions come in already, and I'm going to organize those and pass them along to our presenters. Again, if you have a question you'd like to ask, please use the chat feature in the bottom left of your screen. I'll note that if we don't get to your question during the session, I will make sure to connect you with Jeff or Peter afterwards to follow up and make sure you get your question answered. And with that, we will start with a question about eligibility. Someone asked, is there any pattern geographically to where grants are being made? And for 18, is there any preference in terms of state, region, or type of watershed?
Sure, this is Peter. Good question. Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
Yep, I was just going to talk about the geographic pattern of what we have received, but you can go ahead and answer if you prefer.
Sure, and my response is going to be there is no preference. We are not selecting particular sites and preferring one over another. But Jeff, go ahead and tell us about the distribution.
So in terms of what we have received so far, most of the project proposals have actually come from either the East Coast or the West Coast. We've got a map kind of showing the distribution. We have not received as many proposals from the Great Plains area, the central part of the country. We're definitely open to that idea. It may be that the integrity of the watersheds in that particular part of the country is such that there may not be as many protection opportunities, but we welcome your ideas associated with that. So please feel free to contact us about that. And in this past year, I should also mention that we did receive a number of good proposals from the Great Lakes area, and we made 4 different grants this year to projects in the Great Lakes. And we also made some grants to support activities in the Gulf Coast area as well. So we are starting to pick up different parts of the country that we didn't fund in that first year, and so we expect, as Peter said, to continue to provide resources to the whole country, anyone that qualifies for having a healthy watershed and having great ideas about how to protect them.
Great, thank you both. Another question about eligibility and scope. How does the Healthy Watershed Consortium program apply to urban and suburban watersheds?
Go ahead, Jeff, you want to do that one?
Sure. So I think probably maybe the best way to answer that would be that projects in urban areas are probably unlikely to be competitive simply because of the nature of many of our urban areas, which involves an awful lot of land conversion and often watersheds that are in need of restoration. But that said, if your project involves a large number of drinking water customers and you also believe and can demonstrate that you have a healthy watershed, we encourage you to contact us to discuss. We did fund projects in urbanizing areas, in the Puget Sound area that I mentioned, Chagrin River folks working in the Cleveland metro area, even the Charlotte metropolitan area. So these projects are all helping to support watersheds that are associated with urban areas or urban populations. But I think what we're really interested in is focusing in on the integrity of those actual watershed lands. And again, if you've got good watershed lands that need protection, we would be happy to chat with you a little bit more about your ideas in those areas.
Yep, good answer. Yeah, keep in mind that this program is about large-scale land protection, and most urban and suburban areas don't have large-scale healthy watershed lands that can be protected at a semi-reasonable cost. But as Jeff pointed out, if you can link a metropolitan area with a more rural watershed, as is the case with both Chagrin River and Seattle, that's a terrific combination because you're bringing together water consumers with the rural folks who are protecting the watershed or managing the watershed, and that's a great combination.
Great, thank you. This question was mostly addressed when you reviewed previous grantees, but just to be clear for everyone listening in, when you mentioned successful grantees that used grant funds to, quote, build capacity to accomplish their goals, what did you mean by that? Was it primarily hiring new staff?
Yeah, this is Peter. Yeah, that's a great question and worth clarifying. Yes. So you are able to hire staff or devote these resources to consultants or contractors who are helping with particular projects. So we think that's one of the really important advantages that this program offers, is that it does allow you to invest in human resources to help you get the job done. And that's one reason we're so excited about and grateful to NRCS and EPA for their vision in creating a program that does provide support for human capacity.
Great. Next question. Can source water protection be considered for this funding?
Sure. Jeff?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. We're actually very much interested in a more holistic watershed approach. So if you've identified high priority source water areas within your watershed, and those are the best places to go after in terms of protection, we definitely would support that. We've had some good conversations with people in different parts of the country about source water protection, and we're exploring different opportunities to try to free up some additional funding directly for source water protection. So this is definitely a conversation that we're interested in having with folks. So please give us a call, let us know what you're thinking, describe your area to us, but definitely I would say source water areas qualify for the program.
Yeah, good answer. Kim, let me elaborate on that a little bit. This is Peter again. That kind of ties into a question that we often get, or request that we often get, and that is, will we consider funding development of plans, like a source water protection plan? And we are big believers in plans. We think they're critical to define and guide your success. And we will consider funding plans as a means to an end, and that end being either funding for watershed protection or policies or other strategies for watershed protection. In other words, if you come to us requesting funding for planning, but you don't really have a clear idea of where the money is going to come from to implement the plan, that's not likely to be successful. If you're aware of funding sources or policy opportunities that need a plan to tap into those resources, we would certainly consider that. So if, for example, if your state has funding available for watershed protection, but you have to be able to demonstrate or provide a strategic plan that shows how your protection activities will tie together over time, that's exactly the kind of thing that we're looking for. So source water protection plans that lead to actual activities would certainly be competitive.
Great. A question about funding and match requirements. And for this one, Peter, it might be helpful to revisit the slide that covered those items. But can you please clarify whether the funds involved in this program are federal or non-federal, and how that affects the use of matching funds, whether they can be federal or non-federal?
Absolutely. And Cameron, I'll trust you to make sure that I've got this correct. So there are currently 3 entities that are providing funding for this program. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which is federal and providing federal funding, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is a federal agency and providing federal funding, and then the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, which is a not-for-profit, non-federal entity, and we are providing non-federal funding. And so typically the awards that we give are a combination of funds from each of those 3 entities, and that's all described in your contract. So the typical award is roughly 1/3 EPA, 1/3 NRCS, and 1/3 U.S. Endowment. So overall, 2/3 federal, 1/3 private. We do have some flexibility in those ratios, and are happy to talk with individuals about that. If there's some particular matching opportunity that you have, we can adjust those ratios or try to adjust them to meet your needs. Typically, federal funds can't be matched with other federal funds. So if you're already receiving federal funds for a project, we are not likely to consider those as match for our 2 sources of federal funds, but it could be considered a match for the U.S. Endowment non-federal funds. Cameron, you want to add to that?
I don't have anything to add to that. The general rule is that without some sort of statutory exemption, you can't match federal funds with other federal funds. So the point that you highlighted, Peter, is correct, that these awards are a mix of the two, and so it might be on a case-by-case basis how the ratio breaks out.
Yep. Call us and talk to us. If you've got a specific situation and you're not clear, happy to try and clarify it.
Perfect. Next question. Can you please expand on project scale? Is it intended to be large? Is there a minimal size in mind? Can a certain HUC scale be used as a benchmark? Or is the standard really about where the metrics take you?
Jeff, you want to tackle that one? Yeah, so I think what we're mostly interested in is encouraging people to plan their activities or think about watershed protection at a larger watershed scale. So I think what we said in the RFP was that we'd love to see evidence that you've been thinking about your watershed at least a HUC 8, I think, scale is what we said. But that said, the actual project itself that you engage in might be happening in a smaller portion of your watershed. So for example, if you look across a HUC 8 area and you say we've identified the highest priority places for protection and they're mostly nestled in this one unprotected portion of the watershed in this particular subbasin, that's the HUC 12, your activities could still be focused in on that given area, but at least we know you've looked at that larger area to explain to us why you're focused on that portion of the watershed. That's a little different than sometimes proposals that we've received, which have been organizations that work just in a specific HUC 12, relatively small area, and they don't really think about the larger context. So that's why we're trying to encourage that larger thinking when it comes to putting together your proposals.
Yeah, that's a good and complicated question, Ryan, and folks don't hesitate to call in and ask. Our guidance there was really meant to steer folks away from doing 150-acre projects. That's not what this program is about. What we're looking for are kind of transformative projects that will make an impact at the watershed scale. So that's what we're trying to get at.
We've got ample time left for more questions, so I encourage people to submit them if you have them. Another one while we wait. Is the integrated assessment of watershed condition by EPA considered in your application process?
I'm not exactly sure what the integrated assessment by EPA is, but we will certainly find out. We do not use that in judging or scoring proposals. We do provide a section in the application form for you to convince us that your watershed is healthy and in pretty good condition. And so if you can use that information there, that would certainly be to your advantage. But we'll figure out what that is and make sure we know for next time.
Great. Yeah. That's all we have at the moment. We'll give people another minute or two to get their questions in. A few folks have submitted very specific questions that we will follow up with individually after the session. And again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to contact Peter or Jeff. I'm going to get their contact back up on the screen directly so that they can get your questions answered. And as another reminder, the recording of this webinar will go up on our website within a day or two so that you can revisit it and share it with your colleagues. Well, I think that about does it, Peter and Jeff. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, thank you all. We are, Jeff and I, during the course of these grant cycles, have the chance to talk to dozens and dozens of folks across the country and are just continually impressed by your commitment and your passion and your creativity. And we will look forward to talking with you during this grant cycle and funding some terrific projects. Jeff?
That's great. Just to echo Peter's comments, I really enjoy having conversations with folks, hear about your ideas. I learn a lot in the process, so please feel free to reach out to us. There's still plenty of time before the February 1st application deadline. we look forward to interacting with you and learning more about your watershed area. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, EPA and NRCS, and thank you, Cameron, for keeping us on track.
Yep. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. Have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.